Before I begin this episode, Georgie, my dog, and I would like to thank resound.org and specific artists for supplying the sound effects and music for episode 1. Enter for a short baby laugh, SD303 for a mechanical alarm clock, Spy and DG for kids chair primary school, Tai445 for what did you say, Deep Oak for bird singing, Franklin for electronic music loop 001, Bapped in Dreams and Gear Infinite 010 electronic loop mode bass track 02. Hello, this is Stephen Cockcroft, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode. This is episode number 2, entitled The 3 Views of Reality. Let's get straight into the topic. Academic philosophy presents us with 3 main views of the nature of reality. What are those 3 views? Well, they're called dualism, materialism, and idealism. Let's look at them one at a time. First of all, dualism. What is dualism? As you probably know, dual means of two. And dualism is a view of the nature of reality that argues that there are 2 main substances that make up existence in its entirety. Those 2 main substances are the physical and the non-physical. Okay, we all know what the physical is. We're surrounded by physical things all the time. What about the non-physical? Well, the non-physical is things like consciousness, minds, emotions, feelings, experiences, ideas, awareness. Okay, let's go back to the physical. How do we know if something is physical? If something's physical, it means it has a location in time and space. And it also means that that thing can be measured quantifiably. That means it can be measured in terms of something like its length or something like its weight. Okay, what about the non-physical? Well, you might have noticed that the terms physical and non-physical are actually opposites. And if they're opposites, it means that they should be opposite in nature. And we can see that they are. Non-physical things don't have locations in time and space. Let me give you an example. How about a brain surgeon? A brain surgeon does a brain operation. He opens up a brain. Does he find or does she find a mind inside?
No.
No, he or she doesn't, because mind does not have a location in space and time. Okay, the brain's there. We can look inside the brain. Is there a mind in there? No, there isn't. And yet mind does exist. Minds exist. We know they do. Okay, can non-physical things be measured quantifiably? Does an emotion have a weight? Does awareness have a length? No, these things can't be measured quantifiably. So, on one hand, we've got physical things, matter, physical forces. They have a physical location in time and space, and they can be measured quantifiably. On the other hand, we have non-physical things that don't have a location in time and space and can't be measured quantifiably. They don't have length. They don't have weight. So that's dualism. You have 2 fundamental substances, the physical and the non-physical. And they're opposites, and yet somehow they work together or interact together to make reality or to produce reality. The next thing we're going to do is look critically at dualism. And we're going to ask, does this theory really make sense? So let's consider it. Remember that the physical and the non-physical, as terms and as concepts, they're actually opposite phenomena. That means that they have nothing in common. And to make my point, I'm going to introduce an analogy now. Okay, imagine that 2 people are trying to communicate on the telephone. They're trying to have a phone conversation. And each person speaks a different language, and neither of the 2 people understand the language of the other person. Can they communicate? We're just looking at them using the 2 languages. Can they communicate if the languages are completely different? The general answer is no, they can't. They can't communicate because the two languages have nothing in common. And so the two people can't communicate. They can't interact with each other. And I argue that the same is so when we look at the theory of dualism. Okay, sure, I would argue that most people who live in Western cultures, when they go about their everyday lives, they tend to see the world in a dualist fashion. That's the way they perceive reality is working. Okay, we've got minds, we've got non-physical things like thoughts and ideas, and then we've got the physical world. And these two basic substances work together, they impact one another, they interact with each other, and that's what makes the world go round. Okay, and that's fine on an everyday level. However, if we look at the notion of dualism more carefully and more critically, we see that it actually doesn't make any sense. What we tend to think of happening as we perceive the world in dualist terms, actually, when we look at it critically, it doesn't make any sense. It's totally illogical. Why is that? Well, as I pointed out, the physical and the non-physical are complete opposites. They have nothing in common. And so they have no basis on which to interact with each other. They have no means in which they can impact each other. Okay, it seems like, as we go about life in an everyday fashion, that the physical is influencing the non-physical and vice versa. However, it's illogical. How could two opposite basic substances impact each other, interact with each other, cooperate with each other? It just doesn't make any sense. So, what's going on here? Well, that's a very good question. It certainly appears that that's the way reality works. However, if it's illogical, then it means that the theory is wrong. It makes no sense. So that's dualism. Now let's look at the second view of reality, called materialism. Another term for materialism is physicalism. They are two widely used terms that basically mean the same thing. Okay, what does materialism believe? Materialism picks up from where dualism left off. So materialism recognises that dualism is illogical, and it tries to solve that problem. So what it does is it says it doesn't make sense for existence in its entirety to be made up of two fundamental substances, because those substances are going to be opposites, and so they can't interact, and so they can't work. So somehow we have to reduce reality, or the nature of reality, down to one fundamental substance. And that's what materialism tries to do. Materialism argues that all that exists is the physical, or matter. Okay, that's fine, but how then does materialism cope with the problem that there seems to be a non-physical reality? There seems to be minds, there seems to be emotions, there seems to be feelings, there seems to be awareness and experiences. How does materialism explain this? Well, the truth is materialism doesn't explain it, or it doesn't explain the existence of those things very well. What materialism does is it turns round and it says, well, the physical's real, but the non-physical, well, it isn't actually real. It's just an illusion. So minds, emotions, and so on are just illusory. They're just illusions. They aren't real. And that's how materialism attempts to solve the problem. It doesn't have to explain how two fundamental substances work or interact, because they don't. You have the physical that is real, matter that is real, and the non-physical that arises from matter, but is just an illusion. So that's materialism. Now we're going to look at materialism with a more critical eye. We're going to ask ourselves, does materialism actually make sense as an argument or as a theory? Just before I move on, I want to point out that I'm recording this episode in parts, and I've developed a little bit of a cold, and so my voice sounds a little bit different than it did before, and I just wanted you to know the reason why that is. Also, I should mention that you might hear the odd background noise, like a person moving about, or a dog barking, a bird whistling. We've got some pets here, so I apologise for that, but it's very hard to actually get things absolutely quiet. And like I said, I want to get on and get this podcast episode out. Okay, so let's get back to where we were. Okay, so before we start critiquing materialism, I want to make a few points about it. The first thing is that I just want to make it unmistakably clear that the materialism that we're concerned with here is not the same as the type of materialism that means the valuing or acquiring of physical possessions. Rather, the use of the term materialism in our discussion refers to the view of reality that claims that only the physical or matter actually really exists, and non-physical things like consciousness or minds are really just an illusion that somehow arises from matter. Secondly, materialism in the sense of the term that we're concerned with in this podcast episode is also called physicalism. So, earlier in the episode, I suggested that most people in Western cultures probably tend to go about their everyday lives thinking like dualists. I also argue that many people also tend to think like materialists. Why would many people think like materialists? Well, materialism or physicalism is the view that has been held by their scientific establishment for a long time. And because of that, it's the view that's influenced politics, which has influenced education and schooling, and business, which has influenced the media, all of which has gone on to influence the beliefs and the mindsets of individuals. So materialism is the view that we've been taught to hold throughout our schooling. It's the view that societies have been conditioned to believe. In other words, we've been brainwashed. What's more, as you'll see by the end of this podcast episode, we've also been lied to. So tell me, how do you feel about being lied to? How do you feel about your children being lied to by the system? I know I make some bold claims, but I also only state what I believe can be backed by sound logic and reason, and I aim for all of my material to be completely dogma-free. And that goes for all of my material, such as my books and other material found on my website, stephencockcroft.com. The last point I want to make before moving on to the critique is that even though materialism is the view of reality that dominates the scientific establishment, that doesn't mean it's a scientific view. I suspect some people might need some convincing of that. Well, to that I'd say, ask around or look around the internet to check out if I'm right or not. And as well, keep listening to what I'm going to say here. What I'm saying is not complicated, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. Judge for yourself what I say with a critical and reasoned approach that's also fair. Why do I say that a view that's dominated the scientific establishment for such a long time, and still does, isn't necessarily scientific? Okay, so now I'm going to get into the critique of materialism. There are different ways I can approach this, but I'm going to start by looking at materialism's notion of the non-physical as an illusion. Just to remind us, the theory of materialism is that reality is only the physicality or the physical, and the non-physical, like consciousness or minds, arises from matter as an illusion that isn't actually real. Does this idea make sense? No, it doesn't, and I'm going to look at a couple of reasons why. The first reason that the materialist view doesn't make sense centers around materialism's use of the term illusion. To explore this issue, we need to first look at what is a correct use of the term illusion. So let's look at an everyday example of an illusion. Imagine that on a television screen there is a documentary about lizards. So on the television screen we can see a lizard moving around. This is an everyday example of an illusion. Let's now consider what the criteria for an illusion is. An illusion has to meet two criteria. The illusion needs to be made of the same basic substance as the thing it is mimicking. And also, the subject matter of the illusion has to be somehow like the thing that it is mimicking. So going back to our lizard on television example, okay, on the screen we see something that looks like a lizard. It is a similar shape to a real lizard. The illusion might have similar colouring as a lizard, and it might move in the same way that a real lizard does. Let's see if this illusion actually meets the criteria for being an actual illusion. The term actual illusion is a bit of an oxymoron, I realise, but I think you know what I mean. So, the illusion on the television screen is a physical thing. It's a physical phenomenon. The television screen is a physical thing. So the illusion is made of the same basic substance as a real lizard, because a real lizard is a physical thing. They're both physical things. What about the second criteria? Does the illusion lizard, does it have the same subject matter as a real lizard? Well, yes, it does, because the lizard on television has much the same shape as a real lizard. Okay, the lizard on television has similar colouring to that of a real lizard. And the shape of the lizard on the television screen moves in a similar fashion to that of a real lizard. So our example of an everyday illusion, the lizard on television, meets the criteria for being a real illusion, an actual illusion. Now, let's go back to the real issue we're concerned with, and that is whether materialism's claim that consciousness or mind arises from matter and exists as an illusion. Let's see if the illusion, or the supposed illusion that materialism refers to here, let's see if it really does meet the criteria for being a real or an actual illusion. So in this situation, does consciousness or mind, does the non-physical meet the criteria for being an illusion? So remember our criteria. Firstly, the illusion is meant to be made of the same fundamental substance as the thing that is real. So we can ask, is consciousness or mind, the non-physical, made of the same substance as matter? Well, clearly the two things aren't made of the same basic substance. Matter is made of matter, or the physical. Consciousness is made of the non-physical. They are opposites. So how can they be said to be made of the same basic substance? They're not. They're made of opposite fundamental substances. What about the other criteria? Is the subject matter of consciousness or minds the same as the subject matter of matter, or the physical? What is the subject matter of matter? Well, matter is inert. It's basically meaningless. Independent of consciousness or minds, matter is just inert stuff. Doesn't have any meaning, doesn't have any subject. What about the subject matter of consciousness or minds? The subject matter of consciousness and minds is experience. It's meaning. Our consciousness, our minds seek out meaning, seek to make sense of reality. So clearly here, consciousness or minds don't meet the criteria for being an illusion that materialism philosophy proposes. Earlier I said that was the first reason that materialism doesn't make sense. It uses the term illusion incorrectly. When materialism says that consciousness is an illusion, they're using the word illusion incorrectly, and for that reason their argument is void. Earlier on I did say that the misuse of the term illusion by the materialists is the first reason their theory doesn't make sense. I'm now going to introduce another reason why materialism's view that consciousness or the non-physical arises from matter is incorrect. That reason lies in how materialists describe the nature of matter. Materialists describe matter as being real. And then they say consciousness or minds, the non-physical, somehow arises, comes out of matter and exists as an illusion. So when they say an illusion, they're saying consciousness, minds, the non-physical, it's all an illusion. It's not real. So the materialists are actually claiming that that which is not real, the non-physical consciousness, comes out of that which is real, matter. Now can you see what's wrong with that claim? If matter's essential nature is that which is real, or reality, how can something come out of that nature that is its opposite, that is unreal, an illusion? That doesn't make any sense either. If the fundamental substance of reality is matter, and there is nothing more basic than that, how can its opposite, that which is unreal, an illusion, arise from it? Surely the only thing that can come out of that which is real is further reality. Reality expressing itself as reality, not reality expressing itself as non-reality. I've now presented two arguments that totally discredit materialism or physicalism. Now I want to touch on something I mentioned earlier. That is, I stated that materialism or physicalism has been and still is the dominant paradigm or the dominant view of reality held by the scientific establishment. I said that just because it is the view that dominates the scientific establishment, it doesn't mean that the view or materialism is scientific. Why did I say that? Well, science, or empirical science, is only concerned with physical reality. That's all its model is really designed to deal with. And the problem with that is the issue of reality, or the nature of existence, is a broader issue than that. The issue of reality in its entirety is a philosophical issue. It's a metaphysical issue. It is above the physical. Now, that doesn't mean that it's unscientific either. But what it means is that empirical science is limited in the sense that it only acknowledges the physical. It only recognizes the physical. It only studies the physical. And that's fine, because that's all empirical science is designed to deal with. But the reason we have philosophy and the reason we study metaphysics is because they look at the broader picture. Philosophy and metaphysics don't assume that all that exists is the physical. And neither does science. Empirical science doesn't make the assumption that all that exists is the physical. Empirical science only concerns itself with the physical. And that is very different. In theory, science shouldn't have an opinion one way or the other as to whether something exists beyond the mere physical. Science isn't designed to deal with that issue. The question then is, why is the view of reality called materialism or physicalism? Why is that dominant in the scientific community? Because in theory, the scientific community shouldn't have a position on such a philosophical or metaphysical issue. And if it does adopt a certain position, it should be based on logic and reason. And as I've just shown you in this podcast episode, materialism or physicalism can be quite easily discredited. It can be shown to be flawed quite easily. And like I said, why then, if the scientific community go out of its way beyond its jurisdiction into metaphysics and philosophy, why then does the scientific establishment choose a flawed model? Why then has this flawed model dominated science, dominated the scientific establishment for such a long time, and why does it still dominate it?
Why?
What I was really wanting to show there was that just because a particular view or position on the nature of reality dominates the scientific establishment, it doesn't mean that that view is necessarily scientific. The issue as to why such a view that is illogical has dominated the scientific establishment is another issue and is the subject for another podcast episode. However, in the meantime, you might like to think about why that might be the case. As I said at the start of this podcast episode, there are three main views of the nature of reality or the nature of existence, and we've covered two, so we're up to the last one, which is idealism. Now, you don't have to be a mathematical genius to see that if there are only three options and we've eliminated two of them, that the final option must be the correct one. And so, in a sense, I've actually shown that idealism must be the correct view of reality. However, I can also critique idealism independently, and that's what we're going to do now. What is idealism? Well, I want to start by saying that there are different types of idealism, and by claiming idealism is the correct view of reality, I'm not saying I subscribe to all of those different types of idealism. What I'm really presenting is a very general notion of idealism. And the essence of that model or theory is that the only thing that really exists is the non-physical. So the non-physical, or consciousness, is the fundamental substance of reality. And the physical, or the material, arises from that fundamental substance, the non-physical consciousness. So let's critique idealism and see if it makes sense when we analyse it. To do this, we're going to need to look at some further concepts, and one of those is the concept of nothing. What I'm talking about here when I talk about nothing is a literal nothing. Does a literal nothing exist? Can a literal nothing exist? Now, I know that on an everyday level we use the word nothing. We use the word nothing all the time. Like, I look inside a box and I say there's nothing in this box. But when we use the word nothing in our everyday lives, we're not really talking about a literal nothing. We need to be clear about that to start with. So using the word nothing in our everyday lives, that's not a problem because we aren't really meaning it literally, we're meaning it figuratively. So when I look inside my box and I say there's nothing inside, well, that's not true because there might be some dust inside, for example, and there will be space inside. There might be air inside. So when I say there's nothing inside, I don't literally mean nothing. So we'll go back to the issue of a literal nothing. Can a literal nothing exist? Well, no, it can't, because the word nothing actually, if we break it in two, it says no thing. It's not a thing. Another word for nothing is actually non-existence. So does it make sense to say non-existence exists? No, it doesn't. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's complete gobbledygook. It's meaningless. It's nonsense. So we need to be very clear about that in our minds. A literal nothing can't exist. It's a no thing. A literal nothing is actually a totally illogical concept. We don't actually need the word in our language. Now we're going to go back to looking at the nature of existence. Remember that we learnt from dualism that existence must be made of only one fundamental substance. You can't have two fundamental substances. And materialism took hold of that idea, and it tried to argue that existence is made of matter. That is the one fundamental real substance that exists. And I went on to show you why materialism is ultimately illogical. And the only other option we have left is idealism, which argues that the non-physical or consciousness is the one fundamental substance that makes up reality in its entirety. Now we're going to look and see if that actually makes sense, if it works. Let's now consider whether existence in its entirety is finite or infinite. If something's finite, it means it comes to an end. It has an end. It doesn't go on forever. That's what finite means. Infinite means the opposite. It means that something goes on forever and it has no end. It doesn't stop. So, is reality or existence in its entirety infinite or finite? Now, let's for a moment forget what existence in its entirety is actually made of. And let's just think about that issue, whether existence is finite or infinite. Does it come to an end or does it go on forever? Let's first look at whether existence can be finite. So imagine existence in its entirety goes along and then it comes to an end, it stops. Does that make sense? Could that happen? In order to answer that question, we need to ask what could come after existence. If existence was to stop or to come to an end, what then, if that were possible, would come after existence? Because if existence stops, something has to come after it. Or does it? If something did come after existence, we have a paradox. Because remember, if we're talking about existence in its entirety and it comes to an end, and something came after it, then that something that came after it, if it was something, it would necessarily be part of existence, in which case existence hadn't actually stopped at all. It had actually kept going, because there is something that is still going, that is part of existence. So reading between the lines, we can tell that existence can't actually stop. Existence can only keep going forever. Existence were to stop and it had something coming after it, then what we're actually saying is existence is still carrying on. It's still continuing. Well, you might say existence doesn't need to have something coming after it in order for existence to simply stop or come to an end. Is that true? Is that logical? Well, no, it isn't. This is a little bit harder to get your head around, but I'd ask you to try. If existence has come to an end or stopped, and there's nothing coming after it, how would you know, or how would you tell that existence had stopped or come to an end? You might say, well, it just has. But I'd say that's not an argument, that's a belief or a claim. How would you know that it has come to an end? How could you tell? Well, it's just stopped, you might say. Well, like I said, that's not good enough, really. I could just say, the moon's made of cheese, and you could say, how do you know that? I could say, well, it just is. It's not a proper argument. The thing is, you can only actually identify that existence has come to an end, or has stopped, if something does come after it. Otherwise, what indicates the point where existence ends? How are you going to identify that point? How are you going to identify that marker? What is the marker that shows where existence ends? How are you going to identify that point or that mark? The only way you can identify the mark where existence in its entirety comes to an end is where something else picks up where existence leaves off. That's the only way you can identify where existence has ended. If you don't have that marker, all you have is existence, existence, existence continuing on. You never get to the point where that something else takes over from where existence ends, from where existence leaves off. Existence never does leave off. Okay, we have one last possible answer to this. That is that nothing comes after the end of existence. Now, I argued before how a literal nothing doesn't exist. And so we've got a problem here too. If literal existence comes to an end and nothing picks up where existence finishes off, this would mean that nothing would have to be a real thing. It would have to be a literal thing. And so, as we now know, a literal nothing is illogical. It doesn't make sense and can't exist. So this means that nothing can't pick up where existence in its entirety ends. And seeing we've worked through all our options, this means that existence in all its entirety or reality can't be finite. It can't come to an end, which means existence in its entirety is infinite. It goes on forever. Right, so we now know that existence in its entirety, all that exists, the fundamental substance of reality, must be infinite. It goes on forever. It doesn't have an end. What substance then meets this criteria, or what substance can potentially go on forever or be infinite? What we're dealing with here now is another argument against materialism or physicalism. One of the characteristics of matter or the physical is that it is finite. If something's finite, it means it has a beginning and an end. And the sum of all physicality or all physical things in existence themselves are a physical entity. And that physical entity, the sum of all physicality, all physical things, must itself be finite, because it is a collection of finite things. Its essence is finite. And that again shows that materialism can't be right. Matter or the physical can't be the fundamental substance of reality, because as we now know, the fundamental substance of reality must be infinite in nature. And the physical or matter is not infinite in nature, it is finite. Let's return to idealism. Idealism as a theory says that the non-physical or consciousness is the fundamental substance of reality. Does it make sense? Can the sum of the non-physical or consciousness be infinite in nature? For now, we'll assume that consciousness is synonymous with the non-physical in its entirety. I'm going to explain later why this is necessarily the case. However, for now, we'll just assume that. And remember earlier in the episode, I talked about the nature of the non-physical, how it is different from the physical. And the non-physical or non-physical things, they do not have locations in time and space, and they can't be quantifiably measured in terms of things like length or weight or height or speed. And so non-physical things can't be measured quantifiably or can't be identified in terms of their beginning or end in the same way that physical things can. And if we look at consciousness as being the foundation of the non-physical from which everything else arises, we realize that yes, consciousness can be non-physical. It can be the foundation of existence or the foundation of reality that is infinite. It's not limited in terms of time and space or time and space laws, and it's not quantifiably measurable, and it has no beginning and no end. It's the foundation from which everything else arises, and for those reasons it can be infinite. And so far, idealism makes sense as a theory, but we need to examine it a little more. Remember, at this stage, I'm assuming that other non-physical things arise from consciousness, and I'm going to explain why that is the case now. The answer really is quite simple. To start with, we know that other non-physical things exist. For example, we know that individualized consciousness exists. I have my own individualized consciousness. My next door neighbors have their own individualized consciousnesses. The dog barking down the road has its own individualized consciousness. And each of the birds that are singing in the tree outside, they have their own individualized consciousnesses. We know minds exist. We know thoughts exist, we know ideas exist, we know feelings exist, emotions exist, we know experiences exist, we know awareness exists. So all these non-physical things exist. But I would argue they all stem from the non-physical thing that is most basic or most fundamental out of those things. And that thing is consciousness or awareness. So the fundamental substance of reality is consciousness, which is infinite. And from that fundamental infiniteness, awareness, arises self-awareness, self-consciousness. And from that arises individualized consciousnesses. And from individualized consciousnesses arise minds. And from these things arise feelings, emotions, awareness, experiences, and so on. But the point I want to emphasize here is that all of those non-physical things arise from the most fundamental of them, which is consciousness or awareness. And so, because they arise from fundamental consciousness, they are actually of fundamental consciousness. And because they are all of fundamental consciousness, they are actually fundamental consciousness. They are all a part of fundamental consciousness or consciousness. So we have one fundamental substance, consciousness that's infinite, and all of those non-physical things arise from fundamental consciousness. And they are actually fundamental consciousness themselves because they come from fundamental consciousness. And they're all part of that one substance, that one thing. That is reality, or reality in its entirety. That is non-physical and is infinite. This is basic idealist theory. Okay, so far so good. Idealism is making sense. Just a side note, you'll notice that idealism begins with the word ideal or idea. And so the term idealism reflects the belief that reality is actually founded on the non-physical or ideas, mind, consciousness, rather than the physical. What then about matter or the physical? How does idealism explain that? Does it make sense that matter can arise from consciousness or the non-physical? Well, I argued with materialism that its equivalent notion doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that the non-physical or consciousness can arise from matter, because that would mean that the physical is producing its opposite, the non-physical. Or what is supposedly real, matter is producing something unreal. Again, it's opposite. It doesn't make logical sense. Okay, what about with idealism? Because it seems that it's claiming something quite similar. So does it have the same problem? Well, just to clarify, idealism argues that matter or the physical arises from the non-physical or consciousness. Now this can only work on one condition. It can only work if matter is operating on a secondary level of reality that isn't primary. What do I mean by that? Well, essentially what I'm meaning is that idealism can only make sense as a theory if matter or the physical arises from consciousness or the non-physical, and matter or the physical is virtual, a virtual reality. Again, what do I mean by that? What I mean is, in this situation, matter or the physical has to remain fundamentally non-physical in nature. So the non-physical or matter is really non-physical. It's made of non-physical stuff or consciousness on a primary level, but it emerges as a secondary level as matter or physicality. So if we compare this with a computer game, in a computer game we see on the screen images and a kind of virtual reality, but the information on which the computer game is based is actually just information. It's quite different in nature, stored on a drive in digital form. So perhaps we can look at, for example, a disk or a drive, and we can see the game in its primary form. It certainly doesn't look like a virtual world when we look at it like that. However, we put it into the computer and make it go, and on the secondary level, the game appears on the screen as a virtual reality. So let's go back to idealism. We have the non-physical or consciousness, and from that emerges matter or the physical. Okay, so it's actually made of consciousness or the non-physical, and its primary state is in consciousness or non-physical reality, but it emerges on a secondary level as matter or physicality. So matter or physicality isn't fundamentally real. It is really made of consciousness or the non-physical. So are we saying here that matter or the physical world is a virtual reality or is an illusion? Well, the answer is yes and no. Some people might say, well, if it's an illusion or a virtual reality, it has no reality, it's not real. But remember that it is of consciousness or the non-physical. That is its primary state. it arises from the non-physical or consciousness. Remember how I explained that consciousness is the most fundamental substance that makes up reality, and from consciousness arises other non-physical phenomena like minds and emotions and so on. And then I explained that because they come from consciousness, those other non-physical phenomena are actually of consciousness, and they are consciousness. Consciousness is one thing, and all of those other non-physical things are included in consciousness because they come from consciousness. They are of the same substance. What we're really doing with idealism now is we're taking it a step further. We're saying that as well, matter or the non-physical also come from consciousness or non-physical reality. And so, although they're virtual, they're founded in consciousness. That's their primary reality. And so they too are of consciousness. And so they too are ultimately consciousness itself. Remember how I argued that it's only logical that there can be only one fundamental substance that makes up reality. Dualism doesn't work. And with idealism, that one fundamental substance is the non-physical or consciousness. And if idealism's correct, and there can only be one substance, and that substance is the non-physical or consciousness, that means that everything that exists must ultimately be consciousness. Consciousness is actually all that exists. So the physical or matter in the idealism model is saying that the physical or matter arises from consciousness, and it does so because that expression of physicality or matter is ultimately of consciousness. Consciousness produces that virtual reality for a reason. Consciousness produces that physicality, that material realm, for a reason. Now here we can contrast materialism and idealism again. So remember we looked at how materialism claims that the non-physical arises from matter, and I pointed out that matter is essentially inert, meaningless, has no real nature other than within the materialism context, which assumes that matter is real. Okay, outside of that, as we've shown that doesn't make sense, outside of that model, matter is inert. It has no meaning. And we know that because if you stop and think about it, meaning is another aspect of the non-physical. Meaningfulness is an experience of consciousness. It's an experience for a start. And experience itself is of consciousness. You can't have experience without consciousness. Experience is essentially a characteristic of consciousness. Yet, as I explained too, consciousness is intrinsically meaningful. Consciousness becomes aware of itself, it becomes self-conscious, and it experiences itself. So consciousness has characteristics, and it has meaning. It has intrinsic meaning. And so we know that when matter, physicality, arises from consciousness, we know that it does so as an expression of consciousness, or the meaningfulness of consciousness, or the meaning of consciousness. And consistently, just as consciousness on a fundamental level is meaningful, so too is physicality or matter that arises from it meaningful and an expression of consciousness. And in that sense, the physical or matter is of consciousness. The two are meaningful, both physical realm and consciousness. They are both meaningful, and in that sense, they are one. They are of consciousness, which is meaningful. The physical comes from consciousness, and thus ultimately is also consciousness. The physical or matter exists on a virtual level or on a secondary level of reality, but its roots are in consciousness, a non-physical reality, in primary non-physical reality. We have one substance that is all, the non-physical or consciousness. Consciousness that is non-physical. And so that's idealism. I've spent most of the time talking about idealism because it's the view that makes most sense. And because of that, it is also the view that I'll be focusing on in this podcast. I hope that you see by now that I'm not biased towards idealism. Rather, I'm focusing on idealism because it's the view that makes sense. It's the only view of the three main views of reality that makes sense. And as I said at the start of this episode, there are many other views out there on the nature of reality. And it's not that I've ignored those, it's because I believe they can all be boiled down to the three that I've focused on in this podcast episode. And just to finish off, I'll emphasize that the one view that makes logical sense, I argue, is a general kind of idealism. That's the end of this podcast episode. I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I'd encourage you to keep listening if you're interested in the subject matter. Episode number 3 will be entitled We Have Been Lied To. In that episode, I'll be looking more at the problem with materialism. Bye for now. Thanks to freesound.org and Specific Artists for supplying the sound effects and music for episode 2. Pable for coin spinning, Kathed for no voice, Franken for electronic music loop 001 and Wrapped in Dreams, Aitana for Y×4 and Kevin Hilt for Squeaky Door. Tracks may have been modified and edited for compatibility with the podcast presentation.
We are consciousness.